Okay, I'll admit it. I'm not proud of the choices that led me to this moment. But before you judge me, let me just explain how this all spiraled out of control. It all started because I couldn't afford to lose my job. My boss had been breathing down my neck for months about being late, and honestly, I had no excuse. My car was a piece of crap, an ancient Toyota with a habit of breaking down at the worst possible times. Public transportation where I live is unreliable at best and flat out non-existent at worst. It's a small town, and Uber or Lyft, forget it. The nearest driver would have been 2 towns over, and I sure as hell didn't have the money to buy a new car. So there I was, freaking out because my boss basically told me, one more late morning and you're out. No grace period, no warnings, just, you're done. I panicked. I had rent due, bills piling up, and no plan B. That's when I started Googling alternative options. Now, before you roll your eyes, let me explain. I've heard of people using the dark web to find weird services. I'm not talking about like drug dealers or hitmen. I'm talking about random stuff, like people hiring personal chefs, private detectives, even people who'll fake a relationship for Instagram clout. I figured maybe, just maybe, I could find someone offering rides. I know it sounds insane, but desperate people do desperate things. And that's exactly what I was, desperate. It took hours of research to figure out how to even access the dark web. I watched YouTube tutorials, downloaded a special browser, you know the one, and somehow I ended up on a forum where people advertised off-the-record services. Most of it was sketchy garbage, ads for counterfeit money, hacking services, stolen credit cards, stuff like that. But then I saw it. Private chauffeur, discreet, reliable, no questions asked. It was buried halfway down the page, written in plain text, no flashy graphics or anything. The post wasn't even that detailed. It just said, available 24/7, affordable rates. Travel anywhere, email for inquiries. I hesitated. Everything about it screamed, this is a terrible idea, but like I said, I was desperate. I sent the guy an email, just a basic message, asking if he could drive me to and from work every day for the next 2 weeks. Within minutes, he responded. $200 up front for the week, cash only, pick up at 7:30 a.m. sharp. No small talk, no cancellations. Agreed. I didn't even think twice. I replied, agreed. And he sent me a drop-off location for the cash. It was this weird, crumpled-up envelope taped under a park bench downtown. I didn't ask questions, I just shoved the money inside, left it at the spot, and hoped for the best. The next morning, I was standing outside my apartment, shivering in the freezing cold, wondering if I'd just thrown $200 into the void. Then at exactly 7:30 a.m., a black Lincoln Town car rolled up. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. The car didn't have plates. The passenger side window rolled down a crack, just enough for me to hear the guy inside. "Get in," he said. His voice was deep and flat, like he couldn't give less of a shit about the world. I hesitated. I know how dumb that sounds. I was the one who hired the guy, but standing there, looking at this unmarked car and the faceless dude inside, my gut was screaming, "Don't do this," but I had no other options. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. The guy didn't even look at me. He just pulled away from the curb and started driving. At first, everything seemed fine. Normal even. He didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel like a robot. The car was spotless, like unnaturally clean. No dust, no crumbs, no smell, nothing. I tried making small talk to break the awkward silence. "Thanks for picking me up, I really appreciate it," I said. Nothing. I tried again. "Do you drive a lot of people, or is this just, like, a side gig?" He didn't even flinch. I gave up after that and stared out the window, feeling more and more uneasy with every passing minute. The drive to work was uneventful. He dropped me off exactly on time, like a pro. I figured, okay, maybe this guy's just socially awkward, no big deal. But things started getting weird on the way home. When I got into the car that evening, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't there that morning, but now the car reeked of bleach. Like someone had scrubbed the entire interior in the few hours I'd been gone. I tried to ignore it, but my mind started racing. Why would someone need to clean their car that thoroughly in the middle of the day? I glanced around, and that's when I noticed something else. The floor mat on the passenger side had been replaced. In the morning, it was this basic grey rubber mat. Now it was black and brand new, like it had just come out of the package. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he just likes to keep things tidy. But then I looked at the driver. His hands were gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. And for the first time I noticed his nails, dirty, cracked and caked with something dark and dry. I stared at them for way too long. Was that blood? I tried to convince myself it wasn't. Maybe it was grease. Yeah, grease or dirt. But the smell of bleach was overwhelming, and the more I thought about it, the more I started to panic. Finally, I worked up the courage to speak. "Hey, did you clean the car today?" He didn't respond. "Look, man, if something's wrong, you can tell me. I'm not going to freak out or anything." Still nothing. Then, out of nowhere, he slammed on the brakes. My seatbelt locked, and I lurched forward, nearly smashing my face into the headrest in front of me. "What the hell?" I shouted. He turned around slowly. It was the first time I saw his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes... Jesus Christ, his eyes. They were bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days, and there was this wild, hungry look in them that made my stomach churn. "You talk too much," he said, his voice low and icy. I said no small talk. Then, without another word, he turned back around and started driving again, like nothing had happened. I didn't say another word the rest of the ride. When he dropped me off, I bolted inside my apartment and locked the door behind me, my heart pounding like a jackhammer. I couldn't shake the image of his face, the hollow cheeks, the cracked lips, the dead look in his eyes. But the thing that really got to me. When I looked down at the floor mat as I got out of the car, I noticed something. Stuck in the corner, half hidden under the seat, was a clump of hair. It wasn't mine. It was long, dark, and matted, like it had been ripped out of someone's scalp. I stood there on the curb, staring at it, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. But before I could do anything, he hit the gas and sped off, leaving me standing in a cloud of exhaust. I should have called the cops right then and there. I should have blocked his number, reported him to someone, anyone, but I didn't. Because I still had 4 more days to get to work, and I couldn't afford to lose my job. So, yeah, I got back in that car the next morning. And that's when things really went to hell. The next morning, I barely slept. I kept replaying the events of the night before, especially the driver's face, the smell of bleach, and the hair on the floor mat. My stomach was in knots just thinking about getting back in that car, but I didn't have a choice. Rent wasn't going to pay itself, and I wasn't about to lose my job because of some creepy chauffeur. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the Lincoln Town car rolled up to my apartment like clockwork. I almost considered calling in sick, but I knew my boss wouldn't buy it. So I swallowed my fear, opened the door, and got in. This time, the atmosphere inside the car felt different. The silence wasn't just awkward anymore, it was heavy, oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The smell of bleach was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Something metallic and sour that I couldn't quite place. It made my stomach churn. The driver didn't say a word, as usual, but this time I noticed he wasn't even trying to act normal. His knuckles were tight on the wheel again, and every few seconds his eyes would flicker to the rearview mirror, locking on mine. It wasn't a quick glance either. He would hold my gaze for just a second too long, like he was sizing me up or waiting for me to do something. I kept my eyes down, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I wasn't even connected to Wi-Fi. I just wanted to avoid looking at him. I could feel his presence, though, this weird, prickly tension radiating off him like static electricity. About halfway through the ride, something happened that sent my anxiety into overdrive. We were driving down this quiet residential street when he suddenly slowed the car to a crawl. I looked up, confused, and saw a woman jogging on the sidewalk. She wasn't doing anything weird, just your average morning jogger in leggings and a hoodie. But the way he was watching her, it made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything, but his grip on the wheel tightened and his breathing got heavier. I could hear it, this deep, raspy inhale-exhale that filled the entire car. My heart started racing. I wanted to say something like, "Hey dude, everything okay?" But the words wouldn't come out. I just sat there, frozen, as the car crept along at walking speed. The woman must have felt it too, because she glanced over her shoulder, saw the car, and sped up. That's when he snapped out of it and slammed his foot on the gas, accelerating so fast I got whiplash. He didn't say a word, didn't look at me, just drove like nothing had happened. When we pulled up to my work, I practically leaped out of the car. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. He didn't even wait for me to close the door before he sped off, tires screeching against the pavement. I told myself that was it. I was done. Screw my job, I wasn't getting back in that car. But as the day went on, my resolve started to weaken. Every time I thought about calling my boss or figuring out an alternative, I felt that same crushing weight of anxiety. I couldn't afford to lose this job. I couldn't afford to start over. So, like an idiot, I convinced myself to give it one more chance. When 5 p.m. rolled around, I was standing outside my office building, waiting for the Lincoln. My palms were sweaty and my stomach was in knots. I told myself if anything felt off, anything at all, I'd get out of the car and figure something else out. I even kept my phone in my hand with 911 pre-dialed, just in case. At exactly 5:15, the car pulled up. This time, though, something was different. The back door wasn't locked. Usually I'd have to wait for him to unlock it, but this time it was already open, like he was inviting me in. For a split second I thought about walking away, but my legs moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was sitting in the back seat again. The first thing I noticed was the air freshener. A cheap pine-scented one was hanging from the rearview mirror. It didn't do much to mask the lingering smell of bleach, though. If anything, it made it worse, like someone was trying way too hard to cover something up. And then I saw it, the passenger seat. There was a duffel bag sitting there, partially unzipped. I could see the corner of a tarp sticking out, along with a pair of latex gloves. Next to it was a roll of duct tape, a flashlight, and what looked like a crowbar. My throat went dry. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. I tried to play it cool, keeping my eyes forward and my breathing steady, but inside I was screaming. What the hell was he planning? Why would he have that stuff just lying out in the open? Was he trying to intimidate me? Or worse, was he planning to use it? The drive home was agonizingly slow. He took back roads instead of the main route, winding through empty streets and neighborhoods I didn't recognize. The entire time, he didn't say a word. No explanation, no apology, just silence. The only sound was the hum of the engine and his heavy, uneven breathing. About halfway through, he pulled over to the side of the road. We were in the middle of nowhere. No streetlights, no houses, just trees on either side. He turned off the engine and sat there, staring straight ahead. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, my thumb hovering over the call button. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Hey, why are we stopping?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slowly, like he was moving in slow motion, and looked at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes were different this time, colder, emptier. He smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your skin crawl, like it didn't belong on a human face. "You ever wonder," he said, his voice low and almost playful, "what it feels like to just disappear?" I froze. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't think of anything to say. He turned back around, started the engine, and drove like nothing had happened. By the time we got to my apartment, I was too scared to even look at him. I just bolted out of the car and into my building without saying a word. That night, I didn't sleep. I barricaded my door with a chair and sat on my couch with a kitchen knife in my lap, staring at the window, half expecting to see his face staring back at me from the darkness. I wanted to call the cops, but what could I even tell them? "Oh, hey, I hired a sketchy driver off the dark web, and now I think he's a serial killer." They'd laugh me off the phone. But I knew something was wrong. Something about that duffel bag, that smile, the way he said disappear. It wasn't random. He was planning something. And tomorrow I had to get back in that car. I don't know how I convinced myself to go back. Maybe it was denial, or maybe I thought I was overreacting. Either way, by the time 7:30 a.m. rolled around, I was standing outside my apartment again, waiting for the car. Deep down, I think I knew I was making a mistake. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay inside, call my boss, and quit my damn job. But I was stuck, trapped between my paranoia and the crushing reality of needing that paycheck. When the Lincoln pulled up, I immediately noticed something was off. The windows were even darker today, like they'd been freshly tinted overnight. I could barely see the driver's silhouette through the windshield. My heart was pounding as I opened the door and climbed in. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't bleach anymore. No, this was something far worse, something raw and metallic, like copper mixed with rotting meat. My stomach turned, and I instinctively covered my nose and mouth. The air freshener from yesterday was gone, and the smell hit me like a brick wall. I wanted to ask him about it, but I kept my mouth shut. No small talk. That rule wasn't just his anymore, it was mine too. As we pulled away from the curb, I noticed another change. The passenger seat was empty. The duffel bag, the duct tape, the tarp, they were all gone. At first, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I saw the floor mat. It wasn't the same one from yesterday, this one was different. It was black, just like the new one in the back seat, but it wasn't clean, it was stained. Dark, uneven smudges spread across it like someone had wiped something wet and sticky all over it. I tried not to look too closely, but I couldn't stop myself. Was that blood? No, it couldn't be. Could it? I stared at the back of the driver's head, trying to read him, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. He was as rigid as ever, his hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him alive. His knuckles were pale, and I could see little cuts on his fingers, fresh ones, with faint streaks of dried blood. My mouth went dry. The drive started out normal enough, quiet, tense, but normal. Until we reached the part of the route where he should have turned left toward my office. Instead, he went right. At first, I thought maybe he'd found a shortcut or something. I glanced out the window, trying to get my bearings, but the further we went, the less familiar everything looked. The houses were spaced farther apart, and soon there weren't any houses at all, just open fields and dense patches of forest. I tried to keep calm, but my mind was racing. Hey, I said cautiously. I think you missed the turn. My office is the other way. No response. He just kept driving, his eyes locked on the road ahead. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought he could hear it. Hey, I said, louder this time. Where are we going? Still nothing. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the seat. Look, man, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Just turn around and take me to work. That's when he finally spoke. We're taking a detour, he said, his voice calm, almost casual. A detour to where? He didn't answer. My pulse was racing now. I glanced down at my phone, but of course there was no signal. We were too far out. I tried to pull up Google Maps, but the app just spun uselessly, refusing to load. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The road got narrower and bumpier as we went, the trees pressing in on either side. I started noticing little things. Empty soda cans crushed into the dirt, torn up pieces of plastic sheeting tangled in the branches, tire tracks leading off into the woods. My imagination was running wild, filling in the blanks with the worst possible scenarios. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the door handle, ready to bail out of the car if I had to, but when I pulled on it, it didn't budge. The lock was engaged. I tried the other side, but it was the same. Child locks. My stomach dropped. "Unlock the door," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. "Unlock the fucking door," I shouted, slamming my fist against the window. That's when he hit the brakes hard. The car skidded to a stop, kicking up dirt and gravel. I was thrown forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest. For a moment everything was silent, except for the creak of the car settling and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. He turned around slowly, and I got a good look at his face in the dim light, filtering through the trees. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them dark and sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks. His lips were cracked, twisted into that same unsettling smile I'd seen before. But this time there was something else, something dripping down his chin, something dark and thick, blood. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and icy. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, every muscle locked in place. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a knife. Not just any knife, this thing was huge, like a hunting knife, the blade gleaming even in the dim light. My vision started to blur, tears welling up as panic took over. "Please," I stammered, "I don't know what you want, but—" "Shut up," he snapped, cutting me off. His voice was sharp, almost animalistic. I said no small talk. Remember? He got out of the car, slamming the door behind him, and walked around to the back. I heard the trunk pop open, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the metal surface. My mind was screaming at me to move, to do something, but I was frozen. Then I heard it. A muffled thump, like something being dropped onto the ground. And then another, and another. My blood ran cold. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to see through the rear window, but it was too dark. I could just make out his silhouette, hunched over something on the ground, his movements slow and deliberate. That's when I noticed the back seat. There was a dark stain spreading across the fabric, seeping into the seams. It hadn't been there when I got in. My stomach turned as the smell hit me again. Coppery, sour, unmistakable. I knew what it was. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. Blood. I don't remember making the decision to move. 1 second I was sitting there, frozen, and the next I was slamming my shoulder into the door, over and over, trying to break it open. The lock wouldn't budge, but I didn't care. Adrenaline had taken over, and I wasn't going to stop. That's when I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel. He was coming back. Where do you think you're going? He called out, his voice sing-song, mocking. I turned toward the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I saw his face. He was standing just a few feet away, the knife still in his hand, and in his other hand, something worse. Something wrapped in the tarp from yesterday. Something big. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my phone and started dialing 911, even though I knew there was no signal. It didn't matter. It was the only thing I could think to do. He laughed, actually laughed. Go ahead, he said. No one's coming for you out here. And then he started walking toward the driver's side door. I swear my entire life flashed before my eyes as I watched him approach the car. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, like he was savoring every second, dragging out my fear as much as possible. I could see the knife glinting in his hand, the blade smeared with something dark and wet. The tarp-wrapped bundle in his other hand was dragging on the ground, leaving a faint trail in the dirt. I didn't have time to think. I just reacted. My hands fumbled with the phone, trying to get anything to work. Signal? Nothing. Emergency call? Useless. My brain was scrambling for solutions, but I couldn't focus. All I could hear was the crunch of his boots getting closer and that low, guttural laugh echoing in the air. Come on, he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Don't make this boring. At least try to run. I don't know what clicked in my head, but something snapped. Survival instinct, adrenaline, I don't know. I dropped my phone and started kicking the car door with everything I had. My heel slammed into the handle over and over, my muscles screaming, but I didn't stop. The lock didn't budge. I was trapped. He was at the driver's door now, his face just barely visible through the window. That smile, it was pure evil, the kind of smile that tells you you're nothing more than a plaything to someone. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. We were just staring at each other, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. Then he tapped on the glass with the knife, slow and rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Last chance, he said, his voice calm and eerily cheerful. Make it fun for me. That's when I saw my chance. While he was focused on taunting me, I reached for the back seat. There was a tire iron tucked under the driver's seat, just barely visible. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly grab it, but I managed to yank it free without making too much noise. He didn't notice. He was too busy savoring the moment, running the knife along the edge of the window like he was tracing my outline. I waited until his face was closest to the glass, then swung the tire iron as hard as I could. The sound of the shattering window was deafening. Glass exploded everywhere, and I caught a glimpse of his expression, pure shock, like he hadn't expected me to fight back. He stumbled back, dropping the tarp-wrapped bundle with a sickening thud. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I kicked the broken door as hard as I could, shoving it open just enough to squeeze through. The second my feet hit the ground, I ran. I didn't know where I was going. The dirt road stretched out in both directions, surrounded by dense forest on either side. My first instinct was to stick to the road, but I could hear him recovering behind me, cursing under his breath. If I stayed in the open, he'd catch up to me in seconds. So I bolted into the woods. The branches clawed at my face and arms as I pushed through the underbrush, my lungs burning with every breath. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks that threatened to trip me with every step. I could hear him crashing through the trees behind me, his heavy boots pounding against the forest floor. "Keep running!" he shouted, his voice closer than I expected. "It's more fun this way." I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I saw how close he was, I'd freeze. My only chance was to keep moving, to put as much distance between us as possible. But the further I ran, the darker it got. The trees were so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight, plunging the forest into this eerie, shadowy half-light. Every sound made me jump, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I ran before I stumbled into a clearing. My legs were jelly, my chest heaving like I was about to pass out. I scanned the area, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. That's when I saw it. An old, rusted-out pickup truck, half buried in the dirt at the edge of the clearing. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the windows shattered and the paint peeling off in chunks. But it was something. I sprinted to the truck, yanking open the creaky door and diving inside. The interior was disgusting, mouldy, waterlogged, and reeking of decay, but I didn't care. I crouched down as low as I could, clutching the tire iron like my life depended on it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The woods went quiet. Too quiet. No more crashing footsteps, no taunts, no breathing. Just silence. And then I heard it. A low whistle, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the trees. It was slow and steady, the kind of whistle someone makes when they're taking their time. My blood ran cold. "I know you're in here," he called out, his voice sing-song and playful. "You can't hide forever." I pressed myself against the floor of the truck, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the tire iron. I held my breath, straining my ears to figure out where he was. The whistle got louder, closer. I peeked through the shattered window, my eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything. Just trees and shadows. But then movement. A figure, half hidden by the branches, slowly circling the clearing. He was dragging the knife along the tree trunks as he walked, the blade scraping against the bark with a sound that made my skin crawl. "Do you know what I love about the woods?" he said, his voice conversational, like he was talking to an old friend. "Nobody can hear you scream." I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. My chest was heaving, but I couldn't make a sound. He was so close now I could see the sweat dripping down his face, the way his clothes clung to him from the chase. But what scared me the most was his expression. He was smiling, but his eyes were dead, empty, like he wasn't even human. The whistle stopped. I froze, my entire body going rigid. He was standing right next to the truck, his hand resting on the hood. I could hear him breathing, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. "Come on," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make me come in there." I gripped the tire iron tighter, my knuckles white. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but there was nothing, no escape, no help, just me and him and the suffocating silence of the woods. And then, without warning, he slammed the knife into the hood of the truck, the blade sinking deep into the rusted metal. The sound made me jump, and before I could stop myself, I let out a small, sharp gasp. His head snapped toward the sound. "There you are," he said, his smile widening. I didn't wait. I lunged out of the truck, swinging the tire iron as hard as I could. It connected with his arm, and he let out a guttural scream, dropping the knife. I didn't stop. I swung again and again, adrenaline driving me as I screamed at the top of my lungs. He stumbled back, clutching his arm, but his expression didn't change. He was still smiling, his teeth bared like a wild animal. "That's the spirit," he growled, his voice thick with pain. "Fight for it." I didn't stick around to see what he'd do next. I took off running, my legs screaming in protest, my vision blurry with tears. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. But I could still hear him behind me laughing. I don't know how I kept running. My legs felt like they were about to give out, my lungs burning so badly I thought they might collapse. The woods around me blurred into a mass of dark green and brown, every branch and bush clawing at me, as I stumbled forward. But the one thing that kept me moving was the sound of the truck. was the sound of his laughter behind me, closer now, more guttural, more unhinged. It wasn't a laugh anymore. It was something primal, something wrong. The forest was endless. No matter how far I ran, there was no sign of a road, no sign of anyone, just trees and shadows. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw glimpses of him, his silhouette darting between the trunks, his twisted grin shining in the faint light. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't chasing me to catch me. He was toying with me, dragging this out for his own sick amusement. Eventually I saw something through the trees. An old, dilapidated cabin, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof was caved in on one side, and the windows were either boarded up or shattered. It didn't look like much, but at that moment, it was my only option. I sprinted toward the cabin, ignoring the way my ankles twisted on the uneven ground. My only thought was to get inside and find something, anything that could help me. When I reached the door, I threw my shoulder against it, and it gave way with a deafening crack. I stumbled inside and slammed it shut behind me, sliding the rusted bolt into place. The interior was worse than I expected. The air was damp and heavy, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper and black mold. There was barely any light, just faint beams filtering through the gaps in the boarded windows. Broken furniture was scattered everywhere, along with trash and debris that looked like it had been there for years. I didn't have time to think about any of it. I grabbed the nearest piece of wood, a splintered chair leg, and crouched behind an overturned table, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it, even from outside. For a few seconds, there was silence. Nothing but the wind outside and the faint creak of the cabin settling. I thought maybe I'd lost him, maybe he'd gotten bored and moved on. Then I heard it, that whistle, low and steady, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. He was close, too close. I tightened my grip on the chair leg, my palms slick with sweat. The whistle grew louder, circling the cabin, and I realized he was walking around the perimeter, taking his time, testing me. "Knock, knock," he called out, his voice muffled by the walls. "Can I come in?" I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just pressed myself further into the shadows, praying he wouldn't find me. But deep down, I knew he would. This was a game to him, and he was enjoying every second. The whistling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a loud crash shattered the stillness. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. He was banging on the front door, the wood splintering with every hit. "You can't hide forever," he said, his voice low and taunting. "Let's make this easy. Come out and I'll make it quick." I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just stayed, crouched behind the table, gripping the chair leg so tightly my fingers went numb. The banging continued, each hit louder than the last, until the door finally gave way with a deafening crack. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor was impossibly loud. He didn't bother sneaking. He didn't have to. He knew I was in there, and he wanted me to know that he was in control. I could hear him moving through the cabin, kicking over debris and humming to himself. He was getting closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the hunt. My breathing was shallow, every muscle in my body frozen as I waited for him to find me. "Come on," he said, dragging the knife along the wall as he walked. The sound made my teeth ache. "I just want to talk." His voice was closer now, too close. I could hear the floorboards creaking just a few feet away. I tightened my grip on the chair leg, my knuckles white, and waited. I could see his shadow stretching across the floor, distorted and monstrous in the dim light. And then he stopped. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't look down, but he did. His eyes locked onto mine, and that sick, twisted grin spread across his face. "There you are," he whispered. Before I could think, I swung the chair leg with everything I had. It connected with his arm and he stumbled back with a grunt. I didn't stop. I swung again and again, screaming at the top of my lungs, adrenaline taking over as I fought for my life. He dropped the knife, but he didn't fall. Instead, he grabbed the chair leg mid-swing and yanked it out of my hands, tossing it across the room like it was nothing. His strength was unreal, almost inhuman. He grabbed me by the collar and slammed me against the wall, knocking the wind out of me. "Feisty," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I like that." I struggled against his grip, kicking and clawing, but it was no use. He was too strong. His hand closed around my throat, and for a moment I thought it was over. My vision started to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges as I gasped for air. And then, out of nowhere, there was a sound, a loud, mechanical click. His grip loosened, and his head snapped toward the door. Standing in the doorway was a man I didn't recognize, holding a shotgun aimed directly at my attacker. He looked like he belonged out here, weathered, grizzled, and no nonsense. "Let him go," the man said, his voice steady and commanding. The driver hesitated for a moment, his grip on me tightening, but then he laughed. "This isn't over," he whispered in my ear, before shoving me to the ground. He turned to face the man with the shotgun, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You got the wrong guy," he said, still smiling. "I was just giving my friend here a ride." The man didn't respond. He just pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, the flash blinding in the dark cabin. The driver crumpled to the ground, his smile finally gone. I lay there, gasping for air, my entire body shaking as the man lowered the shotgun and turned to me. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded, too stunned to speak. He helped me to my feet, his grip firm but gentle. "Let's get you out of here," he said, leading me out of the cabin and into the fresh air. I never got his name. He drove me back to civilization in an old pickup truck and dropped me off at a gas station, telling me to call the cops and report what had happened. When I turned to thank him, he was already gone. I told the police everything. About the driver, the dark web, the detour, the cabin. They found the car, but when they searched the cabin, the driver's body was gone. Just a pool of blood where he'd fallen. No tarp, no knife, no sign of him. It's been weeks now and I haven't been able to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, that grin, those bloodshot eyes. I don't use ride shares anymore. Hell, I barely leave my apartment. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. A low whistle, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere outside my window. I don't think it's over.